Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. It's great to have you with us today. As we broadcast this podcast and get things rolling here today, we are exactly 3 weeks to the day from the Canadian general election, the federal election. And, well, depending on which poll you read, I guess the general consensus here, it's very close. The Nanos polling, which is done usually on a nightly basis, now has the Liberals with about a 5-point lead over the Conservatives, which is interesting because when you want to follow that up with one of the other questions in the Nanos survey, who is the best person, best qualified to lead the country? Carney is at 50%. And Poilievre's at about 34, 35%. Yet the polls for the party are very close. Now, keep in mind also that there are regional differences that come into play here. Other polls have it even closer than the 5-point lead. One or two actually have the Conservatives in the lead. But as I say, you can find a poll pretty much anywhere you want to try to suit your political preference or what you like to see happen. The only poll that we've talked about time and time again, but the only one that counts is on election day. And we certainly look forward to what's happening then. As I'm going back and forth with you on our previous podcast and getting some of the feedback, I know we appreciate that, by the way, when you do take the time to comment or ask questions. One of the questions that we basically get here is we are being inundated with information right now on social media, most certainly on the traditional media outlets, whatever the case might be. And it seems that one of the major concerns right now is how do you separate the fact from the fiction, the BS from the truth in situations like that? Well, I wish I had a fast answer for you. I wish I had an accurate answer to say, just do this and you'll be on the right path. It's very hard to tell. And one of the reasons for that is that the people who are responsible for the misinformation are very good at it because they've had a lot of practice. We've seen this happen in past elections. And we know that it's happening in this election. I mean, even before the writ was dropped and the election was called here, we were told by security agencies in this country that they had solid information that Mark Carney was going to be the target of misinformation by offshore groups, not just groups here within the country, but foreign groups, which is troubling, but not the first time that this happened. We know that some of these foreign agencies, Iran, India, South Korea, Russia, have tried to do this, and we don't know how successfully, I guess, in past elections. So it's no surprise that they're going to dip into this one as well. And we've seen some evidence of this, too. I was looking at some social media posts just the other day with some rather ridiculous accusations about Mark Carney and his past record. But here's a little tip. And I've learned this from years in the business, in radio business, in the broadcasting business, and certainly in podcasting. If there's no attribution to the piece, in other words, if it doesn't say where it came from, what agency it was, or who the author is, pretty good chance it's bogus. Because you can throw anything out there. There's no fact-checking anymore. Zuckerberg on Facebook and of course, Elon and all the others basically say it's a free-for-all. You can put whatever you want, say whatever you want, and nobody's really going to cross-check it. So you can put all the BS you want out there. And there's a lot of BS that's going on out there. And that's troublesome, which is why, to follow up another question, I have been so adamant about security clearances with the politicians and for the people that are seeking office. We've already, in the Canadian election, had, I think it's 5 MPs so far, or potential people running for MP, that have had to drop out for a variety of reasons because some skeletons in their closets were discovered. Again, that's, I think, an indication of just how lousy a job they do of vetting the candidates. But you don't know. And I think we, as voters, have a right to know and a responsibility to know just who we're voting for and that kind of transparency about who their supporters are and how, to what extent they're going to actually support them. We already do it at the back end. We demand that all the candidates, successful candidates as well as those unsuccessful, have to tell us where their money comes from. They have to have a very, very detailed accounting of who donates, how much they donate, and we've put limits on that as to what they can and cannot do. But we don't do it in the preamble to the election. We kind of let them do whatever the heck they want, and then we try to sift through that later on. That's wrong, which is one of the reasons why the security clearance is so important. And again, that leads us to why doesn't Pierre Poilievre get his security clearance? And he's come up with some bogus excuses. Oh, it means I won't be able to comment on anything that's going on. Well, that's crap, first of all. First, because if you don't get the security clearance and you don't see the reports, you can't comment on it anyway because you have no factual knowledge of it. So it would only be speculation. And I think in one realm, Poilievre is very comfortable simply speculating and throwing rumors and innuendo out there, knowing that people would have to read the reports to be able to say he's wrong or right or whatever the case might be. So he's got that safety thing. Now, the other element that we've heard from time to time, too, is, come on, Poilievre, he went through the security clearance when he was a member of the Harper government. Well, let me set you straight on that. Security clearances last for 5 years, then they expire. And if you're still in government, you have to go through the whole process again. So it was more than 5 years ago. It was more than 10 years ago that Poilievre was a member of the Harper government. Whatever security clearances he had at the time, they're now invalid. So that's not a legitimate excuse. And we also know that we've been told by security agencies who have done some investigation, and they've had to because of some of the stories we've had over the last 2 or 3 years, that there were foreign entities or agents working on behalf of foreign governments that tried to influence the conservative leadership race, which, of course, ultimately Pierre Poilievre won. Which begs the question, if that happened, and more specifically, it was the agents for the government of India that seemed to have an awful lot of interest and influence, or tried to exert influence anyway, in the conservative leadership vote. Well, we know Poilievre won very handily in that leadership race. Did he benefit from foreign interference? I don't know. I'm not suggesting he did. I'm saying we don't know. There's a question to be raised here. If that was what they were doing, and this is the person that won, how much influence, how much money, how much of the push that they had to try to get Poilievre elected was actually beneficial? It's a good question, and I think we as Canadians need to know that. The other people that are going to be involved in this have already gone through the security clearance, and I guess are looking to be proactive here about what's happening here, with security agencies, and what's going to be happening. We already know that those foreign powers are there. Who do they want to see? Who are they, the puppets on their strings that they want to have in government here? Because it's a good question, because we have to ask ourselves, just who are the supporters and what are their long-term goals here? Is it just to disrupt our democratic process, or is it try to put in place people that they think they can influence or control, as the case might be? Even going way back to the first Donald Trump election, we know from the Mueller report, the much ballyhooed and much condemned Mueller report, one of the elements of that is legitimate is that they know that there was Russian interference. And there's an ongoing question, especially what's going on now, about just how much influence or how much control Vladimir Putin has over Donald Trump, right? This crazy thing about the sanctions that he put in place a week or so ago, the one country, or one of a few countries that didn't get touched was Russia. Why not? Because they're certainly guilty of an awful lot of problems and of dumping steel and a number of other things that are going on. Yet no Russian tariffs were put in place right now. Is that because of the influence that Putin exerts over Donald Trump? Good question. We don't want to see it happen here. As we've talked about on past podcasts, we can look to the States and look to other countries and say, see how it's happened there? See how governments have been corrupted there? We don't want that to happen here. Well, one of the ways that we can try to protect ourselves from that is to go through these security clearances so we understand just who is trying to influence and how much influence those people have on the people that are ultimately going to have power and introduce legislation and pass legislation and basically run the country for us. It's an important part of the process that we've let slip, frankly, over the years, and it is important. And there's so many different facets of this. I mean, I'm talking about it at the upper levels, about how much influence they may have over the elected officials. But in exerting that influence, some of these foreign agents can carry out some dastardly concepts and ideas. And we have heard stories of those, documented stories too, about people who are basically innocent citizens who come from other countries and move to Canada, may run for office, even at a municipal level, provincial level, federal level. But those agents try to influence them at that level, or they try to influence their family members. It's blackmail, political blackmail, basically. Basically saying somebody comes from Iran or from India, and we know that there can be influence exerted on them, like, hey, nice family you left back there in India. It'd be a shame if something happened to them. You don't want that to happen? Well, listen, here's what you have to do for us. And it does happen, or the attempt to make that happen is apparently ongoing. And that's what our security officials tell us. So we've got to be aware of this. And we've got to be, I think, cognizant of what needs to be done. And, we always talk about in elections, transparency. We need to know what's going on. We need everybody to be open and honest about that. But any rules, any regulations that are put in place are only as good as how they're enforced. And we're heading into, as we've talked about before, probably the most important federal election in this country's history. And because of the implications and who's going to be running the show and just what's going to be happening. And not all of it is Canadian-centric, of course. There are so many different outside influences now, most importantly, the one from our neighbor to the south. But there are other elements to this, too. Our involvement in NATO, international trade, and on it goes. So we need to have as much information as we can. And we need to be able to, if we can, siphon through the stuff that we're being inundated with that we see almost on a daily basis and try to separate the fact from the fiction. And I know that, look, a lot of us have our own biases, that we may have political leanings toward a certain political party or an individual. And you try to be open about that too, and you've got to, I guess, factor that into just what kind of an influence these pieces of information or disinformation, as it were, are going to have on each and every one of us. So be diligent about this and be open-minded about this. And as I say, when I see people are simply saying, "Well, look, lay off Poilievre. He's got the right to deny this because he's not technically in power yet." Well, that may be true, but I guess the follow-up question to that is, how did he get there? And who is pushing the buttons behind the curtain to make that happen? We don't know at this stage. And I think it's something that we need as Canadians and as voters who try to rise above some of the crap that we see going on in other elections in other countries. We've got to make sure that the rules that we do put in place are going to be effective and, most importantly, enforced to make sure that we do actually get what we always talk about, that's fair elections and democratic elections, because it doesn't always happen that way. And if we get sloppy and we let our guard down, well, we've only got ourselves to blame, don't we? Well, that's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us once again. Of course, you can catch us on Substack, on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, on YouTube, and, of course, on Blue Sky. So much going on. And so much more that we want to talk about. Stay with us as we go through this process and talk about some of the extraneous influences that are affecting this very important Canadian election. We'll do that in future podcasts. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed. Hey, welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions at these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. I want to start off, as we did with the previous podcast, about the election coming up on April the 28th. And I mentioned at that particular time that I got my voting card finally in the mail just a couple of days ago. And there's a plethora of information in here. Of course, April 28th is Election Day, and you can find out on the card where you're supposed to be voting, which is important. But they also talk about advance polls, which are becoming more and more important because, we have other things to do sometimes, or you may not be home. The listing I've got here says the advance polls are April 18, 19, 20, and 21. And I believe that's common right across all jurisdictions across the country right now. But if you have any questions at all, go to elections.ca, okay? And you can get all the details about whether you're eligible to vote, where you can vote if you don't have a voting card, and what you need to bring for ID, et cetera, et cetera. It's all there. Just go to elections.ca. Better than waiting on the phone for 2.5 hours with some government agents, okay? There's a 1-800 number, too, and I don't think anybody's got that kind of time to sit and waste on there. Anyway, to talk about what's happening and to talk about where we are with the election so far, this is as close as we get, I guess, to the home stretch. A little more than a week and a half, 2 weeks to go here. The debates for the English language and French language debate are coming up pretty soon. And it's interesting to see, just as this drags on, how the two leaders, especially the Liberal and Conservative leader, Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney, are reacting. As we've talked about before, it's a two-person race, a two-team race right now. And there's been good, bad, and ugly, I guess, about some of the things that the leaders have done. There seemed to be a period of time there where Poilievre seemed to pull back. I've heard so many people, so many of the pundits talking about the strategy here. And there's mean, cranky Poilievre, and still, of course, he's mean and cranky with the media. I don't think that's ever going to change. But they seem to pull him back just a little bit. He smiled a little bit more. It looked like, maybe he's not a bad guy after all. But you are what you are, and it kind of draws back. And I mean, just a couple of days ago, he was making a speech and started making fun of Carney's haircut and taking personal jabs at him, which is not unusual for Poilievre. But it's not the sort of thing that draws. I mean, it's I'm sure the base that just plain hate liberals and hate Carney because he's a liberal, they're going to love that. They're going to eat that up. But keep in mind, most Canadians are not affiliated with any political party. And how you behave does have an impact on how voters will feel about you and how they perceive you. Even Carney himself seemed to I don't know why, but for some reason, especially when he was out west for a couple of days, I seemed to get off on the fact that, hey, I'm going to be a witty, funny guy with some of the speeches. I love personality, don't get me wrong, but let's get the job done here first, okay? And as they say to public speakers, job one, if you're not funny, don't try to be funny. The odd witticism every now and then, but this is pretty serious stuff, and these are pretty serious times. So, guys, let's just stick to it, okay? And on that point, there was another element that I found interesting. Now, I spent about 10 years in municipal politics in the Hamilton area back in the day. And so I know a little bit about the impact in it being, that level of government with federal and provincial governments above. And oftentimes, the things that would filter down, be downloaded on, can be very critical. Well, Poilievre, like Carney, both of them, of course, are trying to, I guess, develop some sort of a housing policy. It's an ongoing crisis. I'm sure you've seen the TV commercials for Carney talking about kind of borrowing what Canada and other countries did post-World War II to build enough housing. It was a very effective program. And it's an idea that I think that has some merit. Poilievre, of course, has counted. Both parties are talking about removing GST from home purchases, new home purchases, things like that. We need to vet those, of course. But Poilievre made another assertion the other day that caught my eye, and I just wanted to spend a couple of seconds talking about that. He's talking about basically eliminating the development charges for developers, for home builders, to try to accelerate the process of home building. Let me just put that straight here, okay? Development charges are not a tax. They are how we pay for the development of a new area. When you're building a new home, nobody builds a home. Developers are going to build new surveys. They're going to build neighborhoods, right? And that means building streets. That means sewers. That means sidewalks. That means increased police service, fire protection, public works, and on and on and on. All the things that are involved in a municipality, snow clearing in the winter. And the development charges were an attempt by municipalities to cover the cost. All right. In other words, you want to build it. You're going to make a lot of money selling all these houses that you're going to build, but you got to pay for the services. Those are what development charges are. And Poilievre says he wants to cut those in half, and maybe the municipality will get a rebate. But it still means that half the cost of all those services are still going to fall to the municipality. Well, guess who the municipality is? It's you and me. And you pay municipal taxes with, of course, after-tax money, okay? You get your money, you get your paycheck if that's what you're drawing. There's federal tax off, there's all those, reductions, and et cetera. And your take-home pay goes sit there, and then you have to pay municipal taxes. It's the most regressive form of taxation because it's not based on your ability to pay. Income tax is supposed to be based on if you make more money, you pay more tax, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right? And we can argue about how that tax money is spent, but the fact is it's there, okay? Property taxes at the municipal level are not based on your ability to pay. It's not based on your income at all. It's based on your house, your property, et cetera. And of course, as you age in place, you may be in the same house that's paid for, you're still paying property taxes. And, those taxes seem in just about every municipality to be going up. So if Poilievre's plan would be put in place, that would mean an increase in cost to the municipality. They're not going to bite the bullet and absorb that. It's going to be passed on to the property taxpayers. I just want you to know that there's cause and effect that's in play here, and what sounds like a good idea to somebody standing up at the podium is not necessarily such a good idea. I mean, Poilievre is a guy who's, since all his adult life, I guess, really, has been drawing a paycheck paid by you and me, the Canadian taxpayers, and maybe he doesn't have the grasp of what's going on with the tax system and how it impacts average citizens, because he's always been drawing off the public trough here with his pension, et cetera, et cetera. It is what it is. But the fact of the matter is he's not relating to the average everyday citizen who's going to be impacted by these policies. Yes, we need more housing. Yes, we need incentives. And we have to have all three levels of government working. But too often, what happens is these policies get developed, whether it's a federal policy, a provincial policy, and the municipalities are left holding the bag with added costs. And they have no choice, because municipalities aren't allowed to run deficits. They have no choice but to pass those costs on to you and me as property taxpayers. So let's think these things through, and let's do this analysis wholly about what's going to be happening here. It's very important that we get, a broad picture and an accurate picture on how the policies that are being developed in this election campaign are going to have an impact on you and me. I talked earlier about the fact that we're kind of moving towards the home stretch here as to what's going to be happening. And this is a rather important weekend that's coming up. As I mentioned, in the next few days, the English language and French language debates will be happening. They could be pivotal. You never know what's going to happen in situations like that. There have been some gotcha moments in past debates. Others have been downright boring, so we don't know how this one's going to go. But there's something else that's happening as we do this podcast today. There's an event coming up in Ottawa this weekend, and it's called the Canada Strong and Free Conference. And it's, for all intents and purposes, what it is a conservative gathering. And I guess they do this every couple of years. I've never attended, not been invited, no would I want to, but it's given where conservatism is these days, I wonder if this is the best time to be doing this. And now I'm told from some of my sources in the nation's capital that Poilievre and the Conservatives wanted this conference delayed until after the election. And I can understand why there's some trepidation about this, because this is basically going to be a bunch of people from the Conservative Party. And let's face it, there are some people on the extreme right. The party itself has certainly shifted a lot more to the right than they have in the past, but there are the extremists on that side that are going to be in attendance as well. Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, apparently is going to be one of the speakers there. Well, she's put her foot in her mouth a few times, and with her allegiance with Donald Trump, attending Mar-a-Lago and the inauguration and making some of the comments that Mr. Poilievre is better aligned with Donald Trump than Mr. Carney would be. She's been kind of silent for the last couple of days, but she's going to speak at this thing. But one of the other speakers that's on this list here caught my eye because we've always talked about the affiliation and Pierre Poilievre is the Maple MAGA, the Timbit Trump, as some people are referring to him. And he's tried to distance himself from Trump. He's trying to play hardball and said, Trump is wrong about this. Trump is wrong about this. But as I've said, don't just listen to what they say, watch what they do. A lot of the policies, a lot of the things that Poilievre says, and even the way in which he says them are very much aligned with Trump and Trumpisms and the MAGA approach to politics. Well, one of the guest speakers at this event apparently is going to be one Robert Lighthizer. If that name rings a bell, then good, you've been paying attention. You get extra marks. Lighthizer was the lead negotiator for Donald Trump with the first update of the Free Trade Act. Remember that first term with Trump? The rather prickly negotiations that went on between Canada and the United States, and they finally came up with a revised free trade agreement, some good, bad, and ugly on it. Having said that, though, don't forget that when it was finally agreed upon, Donald Trump called it the greatest trade deal of all and a great deal for America. Now he wants to tear the whole thing up. I don't know if he can't remember what he said to it, 7 years ago, but that's what it is. But Lighthizer was the guy. He was his lead guy in that whole thing, and the guy who was at the table to make this thing happen. So there's, again, a tie with Donald Trump and the Trump administration. And as Poilievre seems to be trying to disassociate himself with Trump, one of his big guys from the first administration is going to be at this conference. Now, I don't know what they're going to talk about. I'm told now that Lighthizer's presentation is going to be behind closed doors. Another shot at transparency. Remember how Poilievre says everything's going to be transparent with the Conservative government? Lighthizer, apparently, he's going to be talking to people behind closed doors, which means no media, which means no coverage on that. So I don't know what's going to be said. I can speculate, though. The guy's a free trade deal. He's talking about trade deals. And clearly, he's not going to sit up there and say, yeah, Trump's really screwing you guys around this time. Is Poilievre going to be able to disassociate himself from this? Why is Lighthizer there? I'm assuming he's going to sing the praises of Donald Trump and what Trump is doing these days. Is that the message the Conservatives want to give as they come out of this conference in Ottawa this weekend? I'm not so sure. Now, I know there are elements within the Conservative Party that love Donald Trump and think he's just God's gift to politics and to free trade and everything else. That's fine, but I don't think, and as a matter of fact, I know that's not how most Canadians feel about Donald Trump. So, when we're this close to Election Day, this association, geographic association, because Lighthizer is going to be there. I don't know who the other speakers are going to be, the Danielle Smiths and others are certainly not necessarily talking about unity. They're basically talking about trying to get along with Donald Trump and sing his praises. And I can understand why Poilievre's people are a little nervous about that and how this is going to be construed, I guess, from as much as the media are going to be allowed to see and hear. You know as well as I do that, yeah, you're going to have somebody behind closed doors, but there's always somebody who's going to say, hey, nudge, nudge, you know what they said? I can give you the inside information on that. Leaks will occur. And this close to the election, is this really the message? And this is the picture people want to paint? I mean, and again, you have to wonder just how the Canadian public are going to digest this and what they're going to think of it this close to the election. It's an interesting sidebar story that could have or couldn't have a big impact on what's going to be happening with voters. Certainly pay attention to that and see what's going to be happening. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks as always for being with us. You can catch us on Spotify, Substack, Apple, of course on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. As we mentioned last time, as we head towards Election Day, we're kicking around the idea of maybe doing a Q&A on Election night or very close to Election night. If you're interested, if it's something that you say, hey, that sounds like it'd be a blast and you want to take part, let us know. Get in touch with us. Our contact information, emails, web pages, etc., are up there on our page, and you can check that out and get back to us, and we'll have a discussion about that in the days ahead, okay? Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed. And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, Critical Discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Great to have you with us today. We're about a week and a half or so away from the general election. The leaders' debates are coming up in just a couple of days. And as we mentioned on a previous podcast, we're going to be doing something with the podcast during the English-speaking debate. I'm going to tell you more about that a little bit later on in the podcast. Before we get into our main thrust here today, some housekeeping stuff on a couple of issues that we covered on previous podcasts. And by the way, I thank you for the feedback that we're getting on all the stuff that we're dropping on podcasts and your input, your ideas about what we should be doing. And certainly, as we've talked about right from the get-go here, your opportunity to weigh in on this, because I think it's so important in a democratic system to have feedback and to have dialogue back and forth about what's happening. It creates interest. Hopefully, it creates more interest as we go forward. And you can have a back and forth discussion about the good, the bad, and the ugly of some of the things that are going on. And a couple of points here that I wanted to give you kind of an update on. One was what we discussed in the last podcast, I believe it was, about Pierre Poilievre and his compliance agreement with they call some discrepancies. And this is a legal document that he signed with Elections Canada, and it had to do with Poilievre back in the days when he was a government minister under the Harper government. And I talked about that, and of course, he's the only MP, I guess, that actually has something like this right now. It doesn't happen very often, but then, of course, most people play by the rules. And in one case, Poilievre apparently didn't do that. I had a couple of people, actually, I think it was one comment in particular that a couple of other people jumped on and said, you're making a big deal about nothing. All he did was wear a conservative golf shirt to a couple of events. Yeah, he did, which, by the way, is bad form. I don't think it's illegal, but it was bad form. But it was referenced in the report from Elections Canada. But you're missing the point. He wore that conservative golf shirt to two events in Nova Scotia as the minister. But the problem is not that he wore the golf shirt. It's that he funded those events, the events themselves, the staffing for it, and the whole shebang with government money. And that's a no-no, especially during an election campaign. Yeah, you can get away with that, certainly, if there's no election going on and you're the minister or whatever, and you want to make a funding announcement. And of course, yeah, they make a big deal of it, and the balloons are out there and everything else. But during an election campaign, you're not supposed to use government money. And Poilievre did, not once, but twice, in two separate events in Nova Scotia, which, by the way, essentially constitute, when you look at the cost of those things, it constitutes a donation to the Conservative Party by the government of Canada. And again, that's a no-no. And that's what Poilievre was guilty of in those situations. And I know if you want to be dismissive of that, even his old boss, Stephen Harper, upon questioning in question period a couple of months after, admitted that, yeah, it was the wrong thing to do and should never have happened. Well, it did, and that's why the compliance agreement is that. It's got nothing to do with the golf shirt itself. It's a matter of using government money in the wrong way to try to find something for a political purpose. And I wanted to set the record straight on that. The other point is something we talked about earlier, and of course it has to do with some of the attacks and counterattacks that are going on. And Poilievre and his team trying to make a big deal, of course, of Mark Carney and his work previously, of course, before he got into politics with Brookfield Asset Management and using tax shelters in a couple of different places. Not, by the way, just for his money. I mean, he was a manager of the accounts. So if you had invested in Brookfield, you may have taken advantage of that. Everything was above board and legal. But Poilievre was trying to make a big deal about it, that Carney wasn't paying taxes and Canadians weren't paying taxes. We've looked into this with a number of different experts, economists and others, that said that a lot of what's going on here, and what Poilievre seems to be playing on, is the fact that most people don't understand how these things work or why they're in place. And as I mentioned in the previous podcast, the rules and parameters for using a tax shelter in situations like that were actually set up by the Harper government. With those governments of those other entities, the Cayman Islands and down in the Bahamas, because there's something that gets used on a pretty regular basis by an awful lot of people, not just the rich and healthy and the wealthy for that matter. But upon further investigation, multiple Conservative MPs have personally invested in that company, in the Brookfield company. And of course, in the interest of full disclosure, we had to have that. Disclosure reports filed with the Office of the Conflict of Interest show that seven conservative MPs, including the deputy leader, Melissa Landsman, and two former shadow cabinet ministers, have stock in investment with Brookfield Asset Management related to the company since 2024. Did they benefit from this? Are they hiding some of their money? Is Brookfield doing that? I don't know. But that's what these people do. So apparently it's okay for them to criticize Carney for managing this organization, which was his job at the time. But it's also okay for the conservatives themselves to benefit from something like this. So, like we mentioned yesterday, you can't suck and blow here. It's either good or it's bad. And if your guys are using it at the same time, then you're being a hypocrite. A very, very hypocritical stance to suggest that it's wrong for Carney to be involved, but it's okay for our members of our caucus to be involved. So that's that. Now, which I guess kind of dovetails to a certain extent what I want to get into today. And that's the other announcement that Poilievre seems to be hanging his hat on these days, and it's the get tough on crime idea. Now, he's made a couple of speeches about this, and I mentioned this when he brought this up the first time. For me and for a lot of other journalists, this is deja vu all over again, because we went down this road when Stephen Harper was the prime minister some time ago. And he basically tried to do the same thing here. We're going to get tough on crime, mandatory sentences. You're convicted, you're a three-time loser, they lock you up and throw away the key. And which sounds great and got great response from some of the partisan crowds at these rallies. And, for people that are concerned about law and order, which should be all of us, it resonates with an awful lot of them. To shoot holes in this thing is not to suggest that, we want to let criminals go free on the street. Not at all. As a matter of fact, the Paul Bernardos and the Clifford Olsons and the Robert Latimers, they're getting what they deserve and what they earn. Paul Bernardo, I know there are some hearings that come up every now and then with parole board situations, and people will say, "Oh my God, he doesn't even deserve the chance. He's never going to get out of jail." We know that, but those are the laws, and that's the way things are going. The bottom line with Poilievre's suggestions. And like I say, he was in government when Harper went through all this stuff. So I don't know if he wasn't paying attention or if he just didn't understand what was happening. But the bottom line with all these tough on crime things that he's proposing once again, which I think he really just dusted off the ones that Harper tried to use back in his day, they don't work. That's the reality here. They don't work. What the Harper government was doing, and what Poilievre seems to be parroting here once again, was essentially what happened with a lot of southern states back in the 1990s. They were going to get tough on crime, and we've heard that rhetoric from American politicians for quite some time. And they went through with it in many different jurisdictions and made down the states, three-strike laws, mandatory sentencing, and things of this nature. And what they found was, first of all, it's one size fits all, and you can't do that with legal issues. Somebody who steals a jacket or even a pizza slice gets treated the same way as somebody who commits a grievous crime, a major offense, because it's the three strikes and you're out thing. That just doesn't seem to make any sense. But here's what happened as a result of this. Yeah, okay, you're convicted, third-time loser, bang, go away, lock them up. You hear that phrase all the time. What it really resulted in was court systems were backlogged, prison populations ballooned, and even more importantly for you people, that all of us who are concerned about crime and about law and order, there was no perceptible change in crime rates. I know, one of the arguments, well, at least that person will be locked up. Somebody else is going to take their place. And as I talked about a number of times with Crown prosecutors and defense attorneys, as we had this debate back in the Harper era days of their idea about crime and punishment, anybody who commits a crime doesn't think they're going to get caught. All right. So, to say, is it going to be a deterrent? No, if you want to rob a bank or you want to do something else, you're not going to say, well, I'll do this and then I'll get caught and I'll do my time. You don't think you're going to get caught. So the idea that this is actually deterrent is really rather frivolous argument. And as the death penalty was back in the day, too. Some people actually wanted to bring that stuff back, too. But he's really dredging something up here that was shot down by the Supreme Court of Canada. There's a process in place. And, if they didn't like the decision, they can appeal, which is what happened, of course, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was ruled to be against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And for whatever reason, if you want to look at this from an ethical standpoint, from a human rights standpoint, that's fine. But the bottom line, as we talked about before, even if you're dismissive of those arguments, this whole idea doesn't make our streets safer. All it does is clog the courts up. We're outraged now when we hear of a story of somebody who's been charged with some grievous offenses. And at some point, some judge has to look at this and say, I got a case dismissed. It's taking way too long to get here. Justice delayed is justice denied, right? And this happened all too often because it's just clogging up the systems. Are we going to pay more money now to build more prisons to house these people if this was going to happen? That's going to cost a ton of money. What's it cost? Something like $115,000 to $120,000 a year to keep somebody in prison. Times how many people are we going to throw away at the key and just leave them there? That's going to cost. It's going to cost more for prisons. Is that really how you think you're going to lower the crime rate, by building more prisons and putting people away? It doesn't work. It costs taxpayers money to the point where now history says that most of those states that tried this back in the 90s have abandoned it because it was a stupid idea. It didn't work. And just as we're hearing story after story from those jurisdictions that, hey, yeah, it was a dumb idea, the Harper government decided, yeah, but we're going to do it here. No surprise that the Supreme Court ruled in the manner that they did. But now Poilievre is threatening, and that's maybe the right word here, to invoke the notwithstanding clause and simply say, yeah, I know the courts say it's illegal. It's against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but we're going to do it anyway. And he made some flimsy excuse that, well, people have the right to be free and not have to worry about crime. Well, sorry, Pierre, but this has been something that has been tried and tried and tried, and it doesn't increase people's freedom. It does not increase public safety. It costs the taxpayers a ton of money, but with no results. I know I wanted to get into the logistics of the notwithstanding clause anyway, which I think is a dumb idea. It's been in place, and I think, again, premiers and others have tried to use and suggest maybe even abuse the notwithstanding clause over the last number of years. Basically, if the courts or somebody else shoots down their idea, they simply say, well, this is my get out of jail free card. I'm going to do this anyway, even though it might be illegal, even though it might be unethical, even though it might trample on somebody's rights and freedoms. I'm going to do it anyway. And it was really a throw-in. We could spend hours talking about the reasons why and the debate that led up to this, but it was really the debate that was going on between the premiers and the federal government to go through with the Charter of Rights and to develop this made in Canada solution to this. And as you might expect, when there was a debate going on between premiers and the federal government, there was not a lot of consensus. And basically, this was a bone that they threw onto the table at the last minute to say, okay, here's your card. Here's a wild card that you guys can use. If you don't like what we're doing, if you think that the federal government's got too much power, you can invoke the notwithstanding clause. Are you guys okay with that? Yeah, okay, sure. And they all signed on. I guess under the premise that, okay, now we can all live happily ever after. Well, we're not living happily ever after. And if this were to go through, and I understand that's a lot of ifs, if Poilievre were to win the election, if he decides to move through with this and try to invoke this, it would be the first time a federal government has ever used the notwithstanding clause in a situation like that. I don't know that it's going to happen. The polls these days, thankfully, are suggesting that may not happen simply because Poilievre's not going to be the guy that's going to make those decisions. But we don't know that. As we said, that's what elections are for. But this is not a smart idea. It's one of these things that's based on emotion, but it's not based on common sense, and it's not based on reality. And you're not talking in the hypothetical here, because this is something that has been tried and proven to be a failure in the past. What's the idea? What's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Time and time again, we've tried this idea about getting tough on crime by throwing away the key and simply say we're going to make this even more punitive. It doesn't make us safer. So why is Poilievre doing this right now? Well, the old grasping at straws thing, I guess, when you're behind in the polls, may come to mind as part of the result of what's been going on here in the last couple of weeks. But please, let's keep this in mind. And let's talk about, I understand emotion runs high during elections, but we also have to have some people that are going to be sensible about this, not just with economic issues, but when it comes to everyday and quality of life issues as well. Which leads me back as we finish off here. In just a couple of days, we're going to be having the leaders debate. Well, the French debate, of course, and then the following night is the English language debate. And on Thursday, the 17th, we are going to be going live for the first time ever on the Bill Kelly podcast. You can join us at 6:30 for kind of a pregame show, members portable on our YouTube channel right now for a pre-debate. You're going to have a live stream Q&A. And we've already had a number of people that have submitted questions and expressed interest in this. And I'm looking forward to doing this. Kind of takes me back to the radio days for years and years when we used to do these sorts of things. And it's going to be interesting to get your feedback on this and your chance to kind of dive into some of the key issues shaping this election and give you some insights into this. Now, you can catch the live stream on our YouTube channel and support the show by becoming a member. And all the details about this, of course, are there. Just a couple of bucks a month, and you'll have access to regular Q&As, early access to content, lots of personal extras, too. And, of course, your support on the webpage helps keep the conversation going and ensures that we can continue bringing this informed commentary. It's been a great ride, and we're going to continue this ride, not just now up to the election, but after the election, too, because we got people engaged. And that's one of the main drives and one of the main ambitions of this podcast is to get people engaged, to get them talking, and to see different points of view. We used to do that all the time. We used to celebrate diversity. We used to celebrate intelligence. We don't do that anymore. It's just that this is the way I think, and anybody who doesn't agree with me is an idiot. Well, that's not the way you govern, and it's certainly not the way that we should coexist with others in this society of ours. So let's keep the dialogue going. Join us if you can. Look forward to your participation in that on Thursday and in future podcasts as well. That's it for this edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast. Of course, you can catch us on Substack and Spotify and Apple and on YouTube, on Blue Sky, and so many other different platforms over the next little while. It's important that we keep talking about this, and we're going to do this on the podcast, and we look forward to your participation. Join us on English Language Debate Night on Thursday, and we'll get into the down and dirty of some of the politics that are going on. In the meantime, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed. Welcome. Another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. As we move forward towards Election Day on the 28th, and gratifying, by the way, to see so many people turning out, especially over an Easter weekend, the advanced polls. That tells you that people are engaged, and I love that sort of thing. It's so difficult, though, as we get down to short strokes. I'm getting a lot of people that are chiming in and asking questions. Did some of that during the live stream a few days ago, right after the English language debate. But so many other questions that come up, too, and I'll do my best to answer them. I certainly do a lot of research into this, and I got some pretty strong opinions on some stuff. From both sides, by the way. I mean, a number of people are there on the political right who will disagree with a lot of what we say on this podcast, and that's fine. That's in a democracy, that happens. When you get into name calling and stupidity like that, I don't have any time for people like that. But if you want to present contrary arguments, but if it's nah, or hey, well, what about so and so? That's not a legitimate discussion or argument. Okay, so let's try to elevate our game just a little bit. But one of the criticisms that I've received is that while you're always trying to draw a line between Donald Trump and Pierre Poilievre. I don't know if that I'm drawing a line, but I can tell you the similarities between the two are so blatant. I'm not the only one that feels that way, certainly, and I think a lot of other commentators on social media and otherwise have made that same statement, and I think there's a lot of validity to it as well. And maybe this past week we saw evidence of that once again. A couple of things that came along, and this was just after the debate. For instance, if you're watching the U.S. news right now, Trump, being the idiot that he is, of course, is in hot water, not just for sending people that have never been charged with anything off to El Salvador to prison for God knows how long. I wonder if their families are ever going to see them again. And they've already done research on that and indicated that 77% of the people that have been shunted off like that in the middle of the night in handcuffs have no criminal records. So, the accusation that, well, they're gang members, there's never been due process, but that's terrible about what's happening. But one of the other things that Trump has done in the last little while is threaten Harvard University to withdraw funds. Now, this is really part of a policy that Trump started regurgitating just a couple of weeks ago that basically said that he wanted everybody, businesses, corporations, learning institutions, to toe the line and what he called get rid of woke ideologies. And I still remember Jane Fonda's speech when she won an award just a few months ago, saying, you know what woke is? Woke is empathy for other human beings. So, and they try to make it like a bad thing. We used to pride ourselves in caring about others and caring and looking after our less fortunate. Apparently now that's not cool with the right wing. But the argument that he's having with Harvard, and just as we do this podcast, comes word out of the White House that, no, that was a mistake. We really didn't mean to do that. Well, it was hanging out there for 4 or 5 days. And as is the case with Trump, of course, because he doesn't think he's ever done anything wrong or said anything wrong. Somebody else is going to take the fall for it. But it reminded me, and I did a little digging to go back a few months about this whole idea about attacking universities and attacking what goes on in universities. Pierre Poilievre has done the same thing. And I'll go back, and there was I think it was around Christmas time, where he was having a discussion and basically suggesting the very same thing, that he wanted institutions, colleges, and universities in this country to basically toe the mark with their ideology and forget about what they call wokeism. And, defund wokeism is basically how Poilievre tried to quote it. And I got a problem with that on a couple of different levels. First of all, their concept of what's right and wrong in education is quite different from what a lot of academic institutions may feel. And more importantly, it's none of their damn business. Where in God's name did these people get the idea, whether it's Trump or Poilievre or anybody else, that they should be dictating what is taught or not taught in schools? Whole idea of education is to make you think. It's to give information, but it's also to make you think. What they want to do now is basically indoctrinate people to say, this is what you must think. This is all you're allowed to learn. You can't read that book. It's being banned now because it might make you think. It might make you give a different perspective than the one that we want you to have. God help us. I mean, I know people, especially on the right, they go ballistic when I start comparing Trump and now Poilievre's ideas, because God help us, and if he ever get in government, started instituting some of these things. But it's so Orwellian from 1984 that basically the government controls everything you say, everything you do. They've got cameras on you, and if you don't comply with these sorts of things, bingo, you're gone. They've shut it off someplace, never to be seen again. I remember reading that. Like many other people, I studied that in school. And it scared the hell out of us, and it should. Basically, Orwell said that's why he wrote the book, because we don't want to head in that direction. Well, fast forward to 2025, and hello, it's not a crazy idea anymore. It's happening, and sadly, our friends to the south voted in a guy who's wanting to make it happen that way. And as I've said many times here in Canada, we shouldn't make the same mistake. We can't afford to make the same mistake. And there are signs here about what's going on. And if you don't like the fact that we're comparing Donald Trump to Pierre Poilievre, the mini MAGA, the Timbit Trump, etc., I'm sorry. But if it walks like a Trump and talks like a Trump, it's a Trump, okay? And that's the way it is. He's copying and he's parroting so many of the different things, even down to the whole idea of his campaign, Canada First, which is obviously a ripoff of America First. Which, by the way, just to give you some historical concept, where Trump got that phrase, America First? Yeah, it was the crying call, the rally call for the Ku Klux Klan, and still is, as a matter of fact, because of the twisted idea that some people have within the Klan and some of the other right-wing agencies that you're a patriot if you basically hate blacks, you hate Jews, you hate Catholics. You've got to be white Anglo-Saxon, supposedly God-fearing, although I think that's a ripoff of the whole concept of Christianity too. And if you're not, then you're an enemy. And that's their mindset. And I don't want to see that happen here. I mean, this is the same guy. Poilievre is the same guy that sat down with Jordan Peterson a few months ago and agreed with Peterson's concept that racism didn't exist in this country, that we imported it from the United States because it was such an issue there. Well, that's crap. Total crap. Yes, we have racism in this country. One of my dear friends, and a friend of many people in Hamilton and Ottawa for that matter, was the late, and I think great, Lincoln Alexander, the first black member of parliament from Hamilton, the west end of Hamilton. Of course, later became the lieutenant governor of the province of Ontario. Just an incredible human being, one of the most incredible human beings I've ever met in my life. But he wrote a book, and the title of the book was actually taken from a phrase his mother used to say. He said, "Go to school, you're a little black boy." In other words, the only way you're going to get ahead in this world is through education. It's an incredible book. I got a copy of it back here behind me someplace, and it's a great read. But he talks about that, and he told me hundreds of stories about how he, as a young child, and even as an adult, even as an MP, faced racism on a daily basis. So, that's only one example of a black man trying to make it in Canada. We already know about that exists. God knows we could go on and on and on about the treatment of First Nations people, Métis, of what went on in this history. Of course racism exists in this country. I'm going to circumvent this right now. Is Kelly saying it's a racist country? No, it's not. That's not exact. This is a country where racism exists. We're not a racist country, not yet anyway. We have it, and we have to understand that it's there. We have to know what it is and take it for what it's worth. And we have to do what we can to try to counteract what's going on with those groups. All right? But it exists. Don't turn your eye or just turn your back and pretend it's not there, because it shows a certain ignorance on the people's part to do that, or a willing strategy to try to say, if we downplay this, we can just keep moving forward on this. There are people that would want to destroy this democracy, and they'd want to remake this country just like they're trying to remake the United States into the way they think it should be. And that's not what democracy is all about, and we can't let that happen here. But I get off on a tangent because I'm passionate. I don't want to see my country ruined. I don't want to see what we think is so great about Canada being denigrated and eventually eliminated to try to pacify these people so they can have their own agenda. Yeah, there's Trumpism. It happens all the time. Matter of fact, another example, just a couple of days ago, Poilievre makes a big announcement. This is the morning after the English language debate. I don't know if you were following him, what was going on, but I mean, the early morning, he's got a media conference. And the big announcement, the big campaign announcement he makes the day after the English language debate is if he's elected prime minister, he's going to bring back plastic straws. I mean, that's a priority, Poilievre, bring back plastic straws, which, by the way, again, is parroting exactly something that Donald Trump did when he took office again. Making an executive order. He's going to bring back plastic straws. In other words, anything that we've passed, anything in the way of environmental activity or environmental protections or human rights activities, these guys want to whitewash it and pretend it doesn't exist anymore. That's part of the fabric of Canada. Those things are so important to us, and we can't let people that are ideologues like this try to tear them apart. Andrew Coyne wrote about this a couple of days ago in a column in the Globe and Mail. This had to do with Poilievre's assertion it was just actually during the English language debate, but he's talking about it subsequent to that as well, that if he's elected, he's got this tough on crime bill, which, by the way, is really just a regurgitation of the same stuff Stephen Harper tried to lay out when he was prime minister, and it got shot down by the Supreme Court. So now Poilievre is suggesting and basically telling us that if he's elected, he's going to cite the notwithstanding clause in the Charter of Rights to basically saying, I know it's against the law. I know that the Supreme Court will rule against this because it does infringe on people's rights, but I've got this notwithstanding card. This is like a wild card that he can play to move this forward anyway. So, and to hell with the civil rights, despite the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I've already expressed my feelings about what a stupid idea I thought this whole notwithstanding clause was in the first place. A number of premiers have tried to institute this, especially in Quebec, and I understand, if they're trying to protect language rights, etc., maybe there's an argument to be made there. But to do it for this, and by the way, if he were to do this, he would be the first prime minister ever to invoke the notwithstanding clause. But as Andrew Coyne wrote in his piece just the other day, he says that Poilievre wants to pass the crime bill, and that's one thing. But he says he doesn't really want to use the notwithstanding clause to pass the crime bill. He wants to pass the crime bill so he can have access to the notwithstanding clause. Because once he does it, once he uses it, once he puts in our mind that that's a tool that's there at his disposal, God knows how often he can use it. God knows what else he's going to use it for. I've looked at this, and because again, it wasn't front of mind for a lot of us because we didn't think that a prime minister would ever threaten, or a would-be prime minister would ever threaten to do this. But abused and in the wrong hands, and it certainly would be if Poilievre had his hands on this, it's Canada's version of the executive orders that basically circumvent not just the Parliament, but the Supreme Court and the laws of this country, and basically give the prime minister free rein to do whatever the hell they want. And we've seen Trump abuse that constantly with these executive orders. He doesn't go to Congress for spending bills, which is the way things are supposed to be. He doesn't care what the Supreme Court does. And I don't even know why he thinks that, because he basically controls the Supreme Court too. But you can't give any individual or any government an opportunity or a right to trample on the rights and freedoms of the people of this country. And that's what the notwithstanding clause can do. Anything that can be used can be abused. And, Poilievre's whole concept about using the notwithstanding clause should scare the hell out of you. For those of us who cherish the Canadian way of life and who cherish our freedoms that have been long and hard fought for. I mean, for the longest time, when you look at the history of this country, it wasn't that long ago that there was no recognition of LGBTQ rights. There was no recognition of, hey, women have only had the vote for a little while. When you look at the long history of this country and of Western society, there's so many different things, so many things. We haven't moved anywhere near where we need to be, but we have moved forward. And I don't want to see, and I hope most Canadians feel the same way, we don't want to see somebody rip that apart to try to satisfy their own ideological demands or the whims that they may have about what they think government should be like. We pride ourselves in the democracy. We pride ourselves on being different than many other countries, even other countries, within the G7, the G8, within NATO. We're different here in this country. We care about people. And we've protected certain elements of our society from these sorts of activities, from government. As Mark Carney said, yeah, he says, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is to protect you and me against politicians who may want to abuse government or abuse their power. And that's the way it should be. And we've got to send a strong message. When you go to vote, keep that sort of thing in mind because it's so very important to this country and to our future. Got to run. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Great to have you with us, as always. You can catch us if you're new with us. Great to have you. We're on Substack, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, of course, and of course on Blue Sky. And by the way, if you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit the notification bell and spread the word on us, too. Lots more coming up in the days and weeks ahead as we forge a new path forward in this country. And you and me and everyone else has an opportunity to be a voice in that with our vote coming up in a couple of days. So go and vote, and we'll talk about that. In the meantime, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed. And welcome. Another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, Critical Discussions in These Critical Times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. We're heading into the final week of the federal election campaign here in Canada, and the debates are over and done with right now. People have weighed in on that. Right now, it's into the home stretch, and we're going to see just how it happens. And, of course, the accusations are going back and forth, as they have. It's been a pretty messy campaign, especially between Poilievre and the Liberal team, and the Carney team. And accusations from the Poilievre team that they're not getting a fair deal from the media, which I know is not the first time that a politician has made accusations like this. So a number of agencies have actually tried to do some research and analyze exactly how this election is being analyzed and how it's being basically carried out by the networks and other news agencies. And I know CBC did a survey not too long ago and suggested that, no, everything is being on a fair and balanced diet, that, it evens out in the end, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that was dismissed simply because, especially the Poilievre team, can't stand the CBC. I mean, they're going to defund them if they get elected. So they say that's bias. You see, there's the media bias once again, blah, 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 blah. So some independent agencies have actually looked into this, and there's some interesting numbers that come up as a result. And the one that I want to quote from is from themaple.com. Now, that's an independent agency, reporters that do their own thing. They're not beholden to any corporations or anything like this. They rely, as far as I can tell anyway, strictly on donations to try to do their work. And they have done an analysis. They've watched the coverage. They've watched the media conferences. And they suggest, as a matter of fact, after they've studied and analyzed all the research, they contend the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, is getting an easier ride from the media events than Mark Carney is, according to the Maple. Now, here's the rub. The data shows that despite Poilievre's constant complaints that the media goes easy on Carney, the opposite is actually true, and the numbers bear this out. The Conservative Party's authoritarian treatment of the media, let's face it, he's been confrontational, irreverent, etc., to members of the media, has led to the point now that, as we've talked about on the podcast, where Poilievre essentially only has a handful of questions, maybe 2 or 3 questions, whatever the case might be, after every announcement. And his team handpicks who's actually allowed to ask a question. And that certainly, I guess, changes the perception as to just how things are going with a free press. But the Maple did a little digging and dug down a little bit to find out what was going on. Not just the number of questions, but that number is telling in and of itself, but the kinds of questions that are being asked. Their research indicates that Poilievre took only 30 questions in English from national media outlets in the campaign process during a 17-day period. 30 questions in 17 days. Do the division and do the math. That tells you where they're going. In contrast to that, Mark Carney answered more than 3 times as many questions in that same amount of time as Poilievre did. That's interesting in and of itself. But what Maple did is, and I was intrigued by this, they went even further and suggested, let's talk about the kinds of questions. So they put them basically into 3 categories. Neutral questions, which are those that just cite information about a policy. What are you doing? What's this about? And basically give them an opportunity to regurgitate. It's neutral, okay? The other element was softball questions that were really about personal views or asking them something that gave them a chance to quote pages from their mantras and the stuff that they're putting out there, the talking points invariably. The other were critical questions. Critical questions, according to the survey here, are questions put to the candidate, put them basically on the defensive, to ask them to respond or to justify why they said this or what are the implications, etc. Well, 31% of the questions posed to Poilievre were critical. 9%, almost 70%, as a matter of fact, were either neutral or softball questions. So you got to ask yourself, are they asking the tough questions? Apparently not so much of Poilievre. Carney, on the other hand, who's taken 3 times as many questions as Poilievre has, 44% were critical questions and 56% of the neutral variety. So not only are they asking, and Carney, of course, is taking and fielding more questions, 3 times as many as Poilievre, but he's getting the tougher questions. And it's interesting when they try to figure out, okay, why is this happening the way it is? And there's a couple of different theories to this. First of all, Poilievre is taking a page right from his old boss's playbook. When Stephen Harper was prime minister and running in elections, he did basically the same thing. It was contrived. It was, here are the people who are going to ask questions. Invariably, they're softball questions because they pick people from the media that are going to be friendly to them. They don't want somebody who's going to ask the tough questions of them, and they try to avoid that. As a matter of fact, I think we all remember it was just about a week or so ago, an incident where Poilievre was going to take his questions from this hand-picked journalist, that hand-picked journalist, etc., and one of the journalists who was not being included in that number tried to yell out a question without going to the microphone. And asked him to please respond. And it was a question about one of the policy decisions. Poilievre simply said, well, that's just a protester trying to make some noise. Well, it wasn't a protester. It was a legitimate member of the media who was trying to get some answers. But Poilievre didn't want that person acknowledged and certainly didn't want to ask the questions. That's somewhat problematic, isn't it? And you have to wonder about the outlet and the results of that. Well, Rachel Gilmore, who is a now independent journalist, and she was in the news a little while ago, she's got some thoughts on this. I had Rachel on the radio show a few times when she was working for Global News in Ottawa. She's left that post and almost had herself a job, we're told, with CTV News heading into the election campaign. For those who don't know Rachel's work, she can be pretty opinionated from time to time, and she's got some pretty strong opinions if you've seen her on social media sites. She did, I think, one session with CTV, and then they basically fired her after that because of complaints from the Poilievre team that said, how can you put somebody like that on? They're biased. It's terrible. It's slanting people's minds, yada, yada, yada. And as is the case, sadly, too many times, CTV News caved in. Well, we don't want to offend the Poilievre campaign. Well, Rachel Gilmore had a pretty strong opinion on this, too. She says one of the reasons why they seem to asking more softball questions of Poilievre than they are of Carney is because if they ask tough questions of Poilievre, if in fact they even get that opportunity, the chances are that they're not going to be included the next time around. In other words, they're going to get shut out altogether. So somebody, I think, somewhere up the chain is making the decision to say, look, don't play tough with Poilievre, or you're not going to be allowed in the press scrums. Well, that's not his call. Shame on CTV if that was their attitude. Shame on them for caving in and basically letting Poilievre decide who's going to say what and when. That's not what media is supposed to do. If you're going to kowtow to a politician, any politician, then you're not a real journalist. If you don't have any backbone, then you're in the wrong business. And it's not just because of what happened with Rachel Gilmore. It's because if it happens there, it's going to happen to others. Because I've seen some of the other accusations that have gone on in the last little while about one or two people journalism, professionals really, who tend to show favor to conservative and to Poilievre in this particular election, seem to be getting the lion's share of the questions at these media conferences. And that's not by accident. And that's just the way things seem to go. But are we, as the public, getting a fair picture of what's going on? Or is it somewhat tilted to one side or the other in situations like this? And it's something that we have to talk about. I know in an earlier podcast, we got into the idea of media bias and whether or not it exists. And as I think I mentioned at the time, just to regurgitate, I don't want to go through the whole process again. There are reporters and there are commentators. Reporters are supposed to report the facts. Here's what candidates said. Here's where they were, et cetera, bang, bang, bang. There's a little more flexibility with commentators. And I know that we as the public oftentimes tend to conflate those two. Frankly, I think sometimes the reporters tend to conflate those two as well. They're not supposed to offer opinions, but let's face it, everybody has a bias one way or another, or at least a leaning one way or another politically, et cetera. Or sometimes, as I found out from talking to some of my media colleagues, I mean, you may have a bit of a bias or a leaning against a candidate simply because you don't like them. It has nothing to do with their politics, but they just are the sort of people that rub you the wrong way, which, by the way, is a reality that Poilievre has had to face here because of one of the other surveys that have been done. A number of them have been done right now, and you see them almost on a daily basis now that we're heading into the home stretch here. The majority of Canadians just don't like Poilievre. They don't trust him. They don't think he's the leader that we need at this particular time. Now, we don't know the results of the election, but and it's at this point it's a big if the Conservatives were to win the next election, it seems to many observers is that would happen in spite of Poilievre, not because of Poilievre. On the other side of that coin, you've got a Liberal Party that's, let's face it, was going to be decimated in this election. The approval ratings for Justin Trudeau himself were pathetic, and he was dragging the whole party down to the point where a number of candidates right across the country, some running for re-election or thought they were running for re-election, decided to back off. I don't want to do this. I mean, because it's going to be horrendous. We're going to get wiped off the map, the political map, and many of them chose not to run. Now, along comes Mark Carney. Trudeau steps down. Carney becomes leader, and all of a sudden, the Liberal fortunes change. And they're skyrocketing, and they're still leading. As we do this podcast, they've got about a 5.5-point lead over the Conservatives with about a week to go. And some of those candidates and some of them sitting MPs that were going to go for re-election who decided not to run have now changed their minds. I'm told that in many of those cases, Carney made personal phone calls and said, look, we need you on the team, and they've decided to change their minds, and that's fine. And we'll see how those races turn out. And of course, we're following those closely on election night, too. But it all goes back, again, to how the media covers. And I know that, for instance, because we talked about with the decision that Poilievre made at the beginning of this campaign, that they were not going to allow media on his plane as he goes crisscrossing around the country. And that's contrary to tradition, shall we say. Invariably, when an election is called, there'll be reporters who will be on the plane. And this happens in American politics as well. You know, you see Trump going back and forth to Mar-a-Lago to play golf, to which he's done just about every weekend, notwithstanding what's going on. The country's going to hell in a handcart. But the media is allowed there. And the same thing here. You know, in real world, and this does happen, for instance, in Carney's situation, there are media representatives that are on Carney's plane, I assume with Jagmeet Singh. Poilievre doesn't allow that. And the reasoning they gave at the time was, well, you know, first of all, it's too expensive. And second of all, it gives the local media at some of these places more of a chance to ask questions. Well, there's two things wrong with that. First of all, if there is a media member, John Iverson, for instance, great columnist, or so many other great columnists that are covering these campaigns, if they're on the plane, it's their company that's paying for it. It's not Poilievre. It's not his team. All right. There are no free rides. And you know, that's something that they didn't seem to want to include in that conversation. So the whole thing that it's too expensive, it's no expense to them. It never was, and it shouldn't be. As for the local media coverage as opposed to national coverage, we could go on for the next day and a half talking about how local media has been decimated over the last number of years because of drastic cutbacks. Some radio stations and TV stations are actually closing down, and you've seen the pictures, and newspapers have shut down as well. I mean, many newspapers, if they're still in existence, have gone to online essentially, and very little in the way of print anymore. I know in Hamilton, the Spectator, which has been in business for God knows how long, for hundreds of years, they bought a big, huge building probably about 25 years ago. The newsroom was incredible. I mean, it was bigger than a gymnasium and desks all over the place, etc. It's a ghost town right now because they just don't have the staff. So the idea that local media can fill that gap and pretend that they can cover everything for you just doesn't exist. It's not there. So that's not really a rational reason for them to do what they did. So we're stuck with what we've got. I mean, there's a week left in the campaign right now. And you've got to, as we've talked about a number of times during this podcast, you got to sift through the BS when it comes to stuff like this. So when you had somebody, as we did a couple of days ago, suggesting that the Poilievre team is not getting as much coverage as the Carney team, it's what they call projection. In other words, when you're doing something to somebody else and you don't want to be accused of it, your first step is to go and accuse your opponent of doing that, okay? Oh, yeah, they're getting all the coverage. Yeah, they're the ones that are trying to sway the media, when in fact it's just the opposite. So you've got to take everything in a campaign, especially, with a grain of salt. You know, when you get a press release from a team that says, hey, this isn't fair, you know, what about this? Just make sure you look at this. And this is what I've talked about so many times on this podcast and previously, of course, on our radio show, is we do have a responsibility to do some research. I'm not suggesting you spend 5-6 hours a day going back and forth and trying to find articles and substantial evidence, you know, pro or con on stuff. It'd be nice if you could, But let's be clear and let's be honest about this. Most of us don't have the opportunity. We don't have the time to do that sort of thing. But that's the kind of due diligence that comes in, which is why I always strive and I encourage others to try to look to media sources. Even though it may not jive with your particular idea or your concept or your political leaning, it's good to know what everyone is saying. And then you, as an intelligent human being, can make up your own mind about this. So on it goes here as we get into the last little bit of what's going to be happening and how the media is going to, they think sway. I'm not so sure that's going to happen, though. Because the polls are open. As we do this podcast, the advanced polls opened yesterday as we're into the Easter weekend. And we're told, I'm sure you've seen the stories, that long lineups at many of the polling stations right around the country. And again, you can read into that what you will. Some suggest that a huge turnout means that there's going to be change. Well, as we're going to get into in a future podcast, what does change mean? It may be something different to a conservative than it would be to a liberal. But what about the average person? Because as we've talked about so many times, most Canadians don't have a political affiliation. They're not members of one party or another, and they can be swayed, not easily swayed, but they can be swayed. And we've seen that happen so many times in the past, where those middle-of-the-road voters who are not really committed to one party or the other do their homework, and they make their decision based on what can happen. I mean, let's face it, when Brian Mulroney won his huge, standing majority government, historic majority government back in the early 80s, there had to be a lot of people that voted for the Conservatives then that you maybe voted Liberal in the past. We're disenchanted with that, so they decided to go another way. Conversely, when Jean Chrétien had his long string of majority governments, you got to figure that there were some people that were disenchanted with the Conservative government that said, okay, fine, you got a guy like Paul Martin running the finance department, you got John Manley, you got Jean Chrétien, I'm going to park my vote there. And I don't know how it's going to happen here. I mean, we'll find out, I guess, on the 28th of this month, just how people are feeling. But the numbers seem to indicate that many of the Canadians, I'm hesitating to say most, but many Canadians have already made up their mind. With a week to go, if they may vote this weekend in the advanced polls, they may wait, who knows. But they seem to know that this is the way I'm going to go. This is the candidate that I'm going to go for here. We'll just see how that transpires and how that's going to impact the results that we get on the 28th. But again, as everything else, take it with a grain of salt. We watch the conferences, we watch the Q&As, such as they are, and again, understand that there's one team that seems to be orchestrating it, the other not so much. And maybe that should tell you something about the character of the individual that's running the show there too. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. Of course, you can catch us on Substack, on Spotify, Apple, certainly on YouTube, the Blue Sky, and so many other platforms these days. Love the feedback that we're getting, and it's just coming fast and furious, and that's great. That's what we want here. We want dialogue. We want an exchange of ideas and concepts. I mean, that's what I think keeps democracy alive and keeps the interest in politics alive. We're in very dangerous times, and we've talked about this so many times, and I know the candidates have talked about this so many times. In starting today, of course, with the advanced polls, and certainly if you don't take advantage of those then on Election Day on the 28th, it's all up to us. It's the voters then that are going to make the decisions. And basically, we're going to set the course. You got Poilievre and Carney, who have basically, let's face it, it's a two-person race. Carney seems to have a pretty decent lead at this stage, but they have very different visions of how Canada is going to go forward and what they want to do to it. And now it's up to you, and it's up to me to decide which path we as Canadians and which path our country is going to take during these very, very difficult times. And we'll certainly talk about that on future podcasts. In the meantime, as we always say, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.